Yeah, it's great to be here with all of you today. So my task was to speak about, is this on? Can you hear me in the back?
Not yet. He'll be on in a second.
Yeah, because okay, great. It's on now. So my task was to speak to you about ways that we might design trials for mobile health, and I decided to choose a particular aspect of mobile health, and you'll see it involves this idea of micro-randomized trials. So I'll discuss that as we go through. So data science, that's my area. There's a number of people in this audience, biostatisticians who are also we're in the same area. And what we do is we want to address questions such as, are the treatments that you might provide to a person at that moment, are they really helping that person? Are they achieving your goal? And then when, where, in which context is it best to deliver that treatment? And so we target this, we focus on these two questions by two different approaches. One is how can we design trials that allow us to collect high quality data? And then how do we analyze data to address these questions? So I'm going to talk about two concepts here, and I'll do them both through the frames of a study that is in the field right now. The first is this notion, we've heard this already multiple times from people, the notion of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. So this is, it is an intervention designed for our area, and in particular it focuses on when you might want to push an intervention. And we're going to talk about randomized trials, and I'm going to focus on factorial trials. So the reason why I focus on factorial trials is I want to help us build interventions. Of course, you're going to want to evaluate your intervention. You always want to evaluate your intervention. But how can we use data and trials to build an intervention? And factorial designs have a long history in both engineering and in agriculture, helping scientists build, well, interventions, what constitutes an intervention in those fields. So Heart Steps is it's a series, we've been funded to run a series of trials, and the target audience group population are individuals who had a heart attack, and now we're trying to maintain their physical activity after they went through an intensive program. But the first trial, we have 3 trials. The first trial just focuses on sedentary individuals as we get put everything together. So that's the trial I'm going to be talking about here. And I'm going to talk to you about a simplified version of this trial so that I can be more clear in how I discuss the issues. So the goal is to build one of these adaptive interventions to increase physical activity in sedentary adults. That's for this particular, the first of the 3 trials. I'm going to talk about the parts of this intervention. So there's decision times. These are times at which you might choose to deliver an intervention. So when I say deliver, I mean push an intervention to the person, right? And in the case of Heart Steps, we decided on 5 different times per day. These are working individuals, so right before work, midday, mid-afternoon, into work, and evening. And there was a lot of discussion about this when we were working through this, because we at first thought maybe we should have the opportunity to provide treatments more at closer intervals in time. But when we went to the data, we found we had access to large amounts of data from Jawbone. We found that among sedentary people, if they were active at all, they were active at one of these times. So that's the reason why we chose those times, those decision times. So the decision times are really based on the dynamics of the disorder you're interested in, not a sample size calculator, okay? The dynamics of the underlying disorder. Okay, so there's 5 decision times per day. The treatments in the case of Heart Steps, this first study, are activity recommendations, and they are tailored to the individual, tailored to whether it's a weekend or a weekday, weather, location, and so on. And they are intended to affect the person in the near term, so to help you be a little less sedentary. Some people call these types of interventions ecological momentary interventions, EMIs, so you may have seen that phrase before. Other people call them intervention options, I just want to make sure we can connect to that. Observations. The kinds of observations are the kind of observations that you and I have been talking about these past couple of days. We have a wearable bracelet. For the first study, it's a jawbone bracelet. It records step count. Then we have sensors on the phone. We know the location of the individual, the weather outside, how busy their Google Calendar is over the next couple of hours, and so on. We also have, I'll show you this shortly, ways to collect utility of the activity recommendations in an unobtrusive way. And then we have nightly self-report. There's a proximal response. That's the response we're trying to target when we provide these activity messages. In this case, we decided the step count in 1 hour following each decision time. I have to be honest with you. It's right now, as far as I can tell, we don't, as a scientific domain, have a good feeling of how long. Should that be a 1 hour? Should that be 30 minutes? Or should that be 2 hours? I don't think we understand that at this time. Okay, so and then the distal response. This tends to be the clinical goal or the scientific goal. In this case, because we're running a 42-day study, it's an activity study, so we're going to be looking at step count over the whole duration of the study. So this is the kind of outcome you would report in a scientific paper. So let's go through the components of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. There's the decision times. In the case of heart steps, these were 5 times a day. Now, in other studies, they may be at very fine intervals of time. And, for example, in one of the MD2K studies, a smoking cessation study, they're every minute. So it really depends on the dynamics of the problem. If you're tracking people who are alcoholic or struggling with alcohol dependence, and you want to figure out what to do when they get close to their liquor store, you're going to have decision times at very fine intervals because you need to catch them before they walk into that liquor store, right? Treatments. The treatments in the case of heart steps are activity recommendations, but treatments can be behavioral treatments, like if you're experiencing a lot of urges, what could you do to take your mind off the urges? They can be cognitive type treatments, how to rethink a lapse in smoking. They can be mindfulness type interventions, social interventions where you get an automated text to a support person who will provide support to you as you struggle with your cravings, say for drugs and so on. They can be motivational interventions. All kinds of interventions or treatments can be provided. Observations, we've discussed that a good bit. Proximal response in the case of heart steps was the step count over the near time, a near time window, and the distal response was the step count over the entire study. But in many settings, they're not the same. They're not so connected. So for example, in the smoking cessation study, the MD2K study, proximal response is stress, and the distal response, which of course is of interest clinically, is time till relapse. We want to delay time to relapse. So if you're a behavioral scientist, in your mind, you should be thinking, these causal models, the mediational models that one normally thinks of when you think of theory in the behavioral sciences. This is closely tied to the way one thinks about theory. The last thing I didn't mention, that's why it's in green, we haven't gone over it, is the decision rules. And the decision rules are what you use to decide when to deliver an intervention, when to push an intervention. They input what you know about the individual at that time, and they output whether or not you provide a treatment, the type of treatment. I'm going to give you some examples. So they're pretty simple examples, but they help me be clearer. So at each decision time, this is a potential decision rule we could use in heart steps. We could look at the weather, see if it's good or bad. We have to have some definition of what we mean by good or bad. We could look at the calendar of the person over the next hour. We'd have a definition of what we mean by busy or not busy of that calendar. And based on those two factors, we could decide whether or not we should deliver an activity recommendation. And in this case, you see in this very simple case, the only time we would not deliver a suggestion for activity would be if the weather was bad and the calendar was busy. That's just an example, very simple example. So this is whether or not to deliver an activity recommendation. So here's another example, another type of decision rule, and this is what type of activity recommendation should we deliver. So we can think of the weather, whether it's good or bad, whether the person's at home, work, or elsewhere, say shopping, the time of the day. We could also include the weekend versus weekday. For each combination of all of that, there can be a bucket of activity recommendations. So you can have quite a few buckets. Actually, in Heart Steps, it's pretty complicated. I think we have 180 different buckets of messages. And if the first decision rule, I called it decision rule A, says yes, you should deliver a recommendation, an activity recommendation at this particular time, then what we would go is we'd use the second decision rule. We'd check out what the weather is, the location, time of day, and we'd then draw an activity message from that bucket, the appropriate bucket, and deliver it, push it to the individual. So we've had two examples of relatively simple decision rules. One, should we provide a treatment at all? Should we even bother the individual? And two, if we are going to provide it, what type of tailored, how should we tailor that recommendation to the context of the individual? So I wanted to show you an example with Heart Steps. So what happens is when you deliver an activity recommendation, the phone pings and it vibrates and the lock screen lights up, and there's in the notifications, that's where the message is. And so this is a message I got. It was a beautiful day in Ann Arbor. It was March 14th. It was in the afternoon on a Saturday. It was sunny and it was 11 degrees outside. It was one of those beautiful Ann Arbor days. And I get this message. This is in the afternoon. So I'm not at work, right? This is a Saturday. So it's not, you wouldn't get this at work. So what warm, healthy treat could I make? Maybe tea, maybe I should try doing a jumping jacks while I let the water heat. So it's just fun little messages. Other messages I've gotten, like at work, one time I got a message, why don't you stand up and roll your arms? You know, so simple little actionable messages that you could employ. Now what's interesting here is you can get rid of this message. The way you get rid of it is you press the thumbs down. You didn't like it. Right? Or you press the thumbs up. You thought it was a pretty good, actionable message. This is great for us because we're going to have, that's part of our observation now, right? We're going to know whether or not you thought the message was useful or not.
Like Pandora.
Yeah, in a sense it is. It's like Pandora. It's imitating, right? Okay, so let's think more about the Heart Steps. As I said, this trial is in the field right now. And so what kind of questions are we investigating? The question we're investigating is whether at each of those 5 times we should even deliver an activity recommendation. We're not investigating the tailoring of the activity recommendation. Okay? So the recommendations we give you will be tailored if we give you one at all. So we're going to decide whether or not we should give you one. And the reason why I think and our entire group feels that this is really important is the issue of burden. We can't constantly be trying to ping you and suggest things because you'll likely habituate, you won't even see the message anyway, and you may delete the app as well. So the whole issue of burden versus benefit here is profound. I think all of us agree with this. And so that's why we're focusing on whether or not to give an intervention. And in what context is it useful to give an intervention? And the first decision rule, the one that said the only time you wouldn't provide an activity recommendation is when the weather's bad and your Google Calendar is busy. That's the class that we're looking at. That's a simple example. Okay, so what kind of experimental study can we use to decide whether or not it's worthwhile to provide an intervention, a treatment, an activity recommendation? And we're using a micro-randomized trial. And this is a factorial design. It's really important to remember this as if you speak with your colleagues. It's not a standard randomized control trial. And as a result, it's not intended to evaluate a just-in-time adaptive intervention. That's not the purpose of these trials. They're to help us build a good, high-quality, just-in-time adaptive intervention. That's the purpose. So the sample size considerations are quite different from a standard randomized control trial. So as we think about how to size this study, we have to think about what should be the first question and what should be second, third, fourth questions. Whenever I think like this, I have in my mind the specific aims. I can't help it. So what should be the first specific aim? What should be the second specific aim? This is what I'm thinking in my head. So that first question often is related to what I would call the first specific aim, and that's how I size the study. And here is, do these tailored activity recommendations even affect step count? Do they have any effect at all? Because if they don't, I mean, let's just do something different, right? And that question will be used to determine the required number of participants. And I'll show you an example of the number of participants that you would get in heart steps. Of course, the second question, further questions, that's where the science is, right? That's where both you and me as a statistician, and many of the people who are behavioral science, this is where it really makes us happy. I mean, this is what we really are interested in. And here, natural second question is, does the busyness of the user's calendar, say the day of the week, if it's weekend versus weekday, does the weather impact the effectiveness of those activity recommendations? These are, in the words of the behavioral science, moderation, questions about moderation, right? You can imagine many, many more questions that you might investigate. For example, there may be baseline characteristics of individuals which would lead to more responsivity to messages versus not, and so on. Stress may be a big factor here. Burden, the current level of burden. How many times I've been pressing the down button over the recent past may be a really good reason why you should not provide an intervention at the next time, so on. All of this helps us build our just-in-time adaptive intervention decision rules. Okay, so we're back into heart steps now. Remember, in heart steps, there's 5 decision times per day, 42 days, 210 decision times. In the MD2K study, it's decision times every minute, let's say 10 hours a day just for simplicity. So that's 60 times 10 times 14 days. Many, many decision times. So in heart steps, we're going to randomize at each decision time to tailored activity recommendation versus nothing. Now, we have to be realistic when we design this study. The ever-present issue of burden treatment fatigue is sitting there right next to us. It's always present, right? So if you talk to a biostatistician or a statistician, what randomization probability do you think we want? 1/2, right? We always want 1/2 because that's how you get highest power. But that's not feasible in many of these settings because then you're going to be providing interventions all the time. People who habituate, they'll delete the app, it's over. The whole study is over. So when we thought about what fraction of the time we should randomize to an activity recommendation, we thought, well, on average, how many recommendations should a person get per day? And we were thinking 2. So that's the reason why we chose 40% of the time. In the MD2K study, the probabilities are going to be very low indeed because there we only want 3 to 4 recommendations a day. And we have 60 times 10 decision points, so you can imagine. Yeah?
Are those data-driven decisions, or is that just kind of gut instinct? 2 times a day seems like it's probably reasonable out of the budget.
I think when we spoke about it, the behavioral scientists there's 2 behavioral scientists on this team. They looked at how often, there's been a lot of activity studies with text messaging, and they looked about how many times people had been sending it in the past, and they used their own clinical judgment. You're totally right, though. A lot of this, however, the design of the study is informed by your understanding of the behavioral theories, your readings of the current literature, right? Your clinical experience in working with people. And in fact, our next couple of studies will have a lot of participant user interaction before they're designed. So this would be something we might ask potential users as well. So all of that goes into the design of these studies, including how many decision points there should be, when they should be, and so on. Okay. So let's go through the components of a micro-randomized trial. It sort of looks like a just-in-time adaptive intervention. I mean, it sort of kind of does, because you have the decision times. They're the exact same decision times. You have the observations. They're the exact same observations. You have the exact same proximal response. You have the same distal response. It looks like a just-in-time adaptive intervention. The difference here is in a micro-randomized trial, at the decision points, you randomize the treatments. We didn't do that in the just-in-time adaptive intervention. And we don't have decision rules about what to do because we're going to discover that. We're going to discover whether or not we should provide a treatment at a decision time, as opposed to stating what the decision rules are up front. Notice in Heart Steps, the tailoring of the recommendation, that is stated up front. So in any micro-randomized trial, there will be some decision rules that are already set into play. And in this case of Heart Steps, the decision rule as to what kind of activity recommendation, the form of the activity recommendation, that's set in, we decided we had enough information about how to do that. What we needed to investigate was whether or not to provide an activity recommendation. I have to be honest with you, Heart Steps is more complicated than this. We're also randomizing in the evening as well. So, but I want to be clear. I want clarity, so I just focused on this particular case. So in a micro-randomized trial, what do? You as the scientist, you randomize among the treatments at decision times. You record your observations using sensors, self-report data. You record your outcomes. After the study is over, you have your data set. You have a stream of data for each individual, pretty complex data. And you analyze that data. And you use that data to assess, did I have a treatment effect? Did my recommendations affect the activity of the person in the near time? And use this to inform decision rule development. Already people in the MD2 case study, I'm very stressed actually, to be honest, because they're asking about mediation analyses. You can imagine if you're into mediation analyses, that's going to be a big interest in this setting. And how do we do that in this world? So that's a different kind of analysis you might do with the data once you have it. Okay, so I'm focusing on the sample size right now because I'm thinking about the design of the study. Well, the study's in the field, but in our conversation here, we're thinking about how to size the study. And so that first question was, do these tailored activity recommendations, are they doing anything for us? Are they increasing step count? And so I have to think conceptually about this. And here we have a treatment which is time varying, right? At each decision time, you may or may not get an activity recommendation. In the decision times, there's 210. So 200, right. So also I have to think of an effect that might be changing over time. So just as I have a time-varying treatment, I might have a time-varying treatment effect. And here's a little graphic and intuition that's helping me think about the problem. So I have my 210 decision points across the x-axis. I have a standardized treatment effect. So this is the usual number of standard deviations in terms of activity if you get a recommendation versus if you don't. And I figure intuitively, at the very beginning of the study, like the first time, people are so confused, they may not do anything. They don't know what to do with that recommendation. Then as the decision times increase, there's probably trends. There's probably daily trends. There's weekend trends that's kind of all varying around this. But the average over time, as time increases, people will start to take advantage of these recommendations. They'll try them out. They'll be a little bit more active than they would have been had they not gotten a recommendation. They check it out. Things go well. And then, unfortunately, they start to habituate on me. And by that, I mean the messages kind of just go by. And I'm concerned about a downturn. I don't know when it'll occur, but I'm concerned about that. So this is how we think about the effect of the intervention as a time-varying effect. And the way we size the study is we ask, well, do we have some curve that's above the line 0, above this straight line across at 0, or not? That's how we size it, because we want to know, do we ever get above 0? Do we ever have an impact on these people? Now, this is really interesting. I think for people in the quantitative fields of the behavioral sciences, this makes a lot of sense. But for someone like me, and maybe for biostatisticians, it would also make a lot of sense. But it really, I mean, it was, at first, I just didn't believe this would be the case. So I just want to explain it to you if you're sort of like me. So if I think that I might have a gradually increasing effect that'll then potentially decrease with time, the minute I start sizing or finding a sample size to detect that kind of effect, I've made a bet. The bet I've made is that the way the effect changes with time is sort of smooth. It's not like one day that activity recommendation makes me run out and run. The next day it doesn't have any effect. You know, it's a smooth sort of effect across people. What this does is it opens the door to not only between-person comparisons, a person who gets a recommendation at a decision time versus another person who does not get a recommendation at that same decision time. That's a between-person comparison. It also opens the door to within-person comparisons. When I got a recommendation at a time versus at another point in time when I didn't. And having that conjecture of a smooth outcome, that's what enables that. What that means is the sample sizes are smaller because you're using between and within person contrast. And this is really clear to quantitative behavioral scientists. But for a straight statistician, we're not used to that. And I was surprised at first. I thought the student had a bug, but he didn't. So here's the sample sizes. So we were looking for 80% power, type 1 error rate of 0.05. Remember, our hypothesis is, do we ever have an effect on step count? And so this is in these are standardized effects. If you're used to sizing trials, you should be aghast. These are incredibly small standardized effects. I'm going to make a comment about that shortly. And here's the sample sizes, relatively small sample size. This is due to the within-person contrast. The point I want to make to you is, okay, if you're used to 2-arm randomized trials, these are very small standardized effect sizes. Like a 2-arm randomized trial, 0.2 would be a very small standardized effect size, right? And these are half, even smaller. But we don't know yet. You and I, in our world, we don't know what large and small effect sizes in our world. So it could be these are large or small. We just don't know. And now I'm part of 3 different micro-randomized studies, so I'm going to get more and more intuition. I'll be able to, maybe in a year or two when you see me, if we see each other again, I'll be able to give you some feeling about whether these are large or small. That's great. So, okay, so now I want to bring up something that's very disturbing, but it makes perfect sense if you're worried about burden. And that's the issue of availability. And Hilal, I don't know where he is. I've lost him. Yeah, there he is. He briefly mentioned this yesterday. And I'm going to have kind of an extended view of availability, but it's a critical issue, I think, when you're worried about burden. And here's the Heart Steps little notification. So we had thumbs down, thumbs up. I could also press that button in the middle. If I press that button in the middle, it's a snooze button. A little drop screen menu comes down. I can snooze the intervention for 4, 8, or 12 hours. So when I go to an NIH review committee meeting, I snooze the intervention in the morning for the entire day because I don't want to be bothered. In fact, having a snooze button and having a settings area where you can turn off the intervention, this allows that person to have control over that intervention. I think this is what we have to do going forward. There's other times that we will not provide an intervention. We'll have the Google classifier of whether or not you're driving, currently going very fast. If it looks like you're going really fast, we say, okay, we're not going to bother you. We're too concerned that you might be driving and we'll distract you and you'll have an accident. You're considered unavailable at that time. If you're currently walking, if our classifier detects that you're currently walking, we're not going to ping you and suggest, why don't you go for a walk? I mean, that would be awful, right? So again, you're unavailable. So there's 3 ways people are unavailable for an intervention in this study. They've turned it off. They're already walking. They're already being active. Or they're driving, and it's really essentially unethical to distract them. So what does that mean? That means the potential decision rules always have this green in them. They always have that green statement in. They always have a green phrase. It makes no sense to say, what would be the effect of the intervention if a person was unavailable? It just doesn't make sense. When we go to think about this time-varying effect of the activity recommendation on step count, this has a meaning, another meaning, in addition to the fact that people might habituate with time and start ignoring you. Now, the group of people who are available for treatment is varying over time. So you may have a subset of people who've drunk the Kool-Aid, and they're being active, right? They're no longer available, so they won't even be in this effect. And then you'll have another group who may be turning off the intervention, and they also will not be available. So for those reasons alone, you're going to also have a time-varying effect. And that means it's really important to have a time-varying effect because we interpret each effect at that time. So this is the effect at this time. Among the people who are available. Availability is probably impacted by the treatments you gave them before, right? Of course it is, but these are still causal effects because we're randomizing that activity recommendation. Among the people who are available, that is, among the people for whom it's ethical to provide a treatment, who are willing to allow us to provide a treatment, and that it makes scientific sense to make a treatment, we assess the treatment effect at each time. Among the people who allow us to, that is, they haven't turned off the intervention, it's ethical, they're not driving, and it makes scientific sense to assess the effect of the intervention. They're not walking currently. If they're walking, it doesn't make scientific sense to provide. That group of people, we assess the effect of the intervention. At each time, these are causal effects. That's the randomization. That's what it gives us. So those sample sizes I gave you were for 50% availability. That's why they're so large. I'm assuming around half the time people are not available. So we could do it for 70% availability, for example. And again, this is another setting, like going back to the question you raised earlier, how do I know how much availability we have? These are all things we have to learn. And that's why it's good that we're running a series of 3 trials, right? We're going to learn this and do better and better. Of course, the subsequent data analyses are the kind we like. Audrey, who's a postdoc who's working with me somewhere, I don't know where she is. Yeah, she's working on how you can assess the context, whether or not the effectiveness of the activity recommendation depends on the context. There's a lot of cool machine learning. If you're a machine learning kind of guy, there's a lot of cool machine learning actually in this area. It's the area of reinforcement learning, if you're familiar with that area. It's totally cool. That's all I have to say. Okay, and then I just wanted to have, I'm almost done. I just want to go through, people get really excited, and I think we have to be really upfront with ourselves about when this is useful and when it's not. When are these trials just totally not useful? If you're looking or if you're studying a malleable circumstance which occurs very rarely, here I give an example of suicide, but in another case we had an investigator come to us who studies people who are struggling with bipolar disorder, and he was trying to figure out what should you do when there's signs that a person is entering a manic phase. Even people with bipolar disorder don't enter manic phases, routinely. So that's not a setting in which it's useful to run a micro-randomized trial. If that's your question, what to do when someone's entering a manic phase. It is useful when the malleable circumstances change rapidly. And this is a lot of what people in this room have been talking about. That's exactly our setting. Stress occurs rapidly. Urges to smoke, whether or not you're adhering to meds, even if you just take your meds every day, once a day, it's still changing rapidly. It's not every 5 months. Physical activity, eating. Another setting in which it's not useful, and I want to trigger off the last speaker's points because his talk really made this come straight home to me. Right now, I have all these types of proximal responses that I feel that we cannot feasibly assess. We can't observe it, like urge to smoke. However, as our last speaker pointed out, you can make up for bad sensors by good machine learning, potentially. So if you can get good predictions, you could then change this to a not useful to a useful setting. So right now, urge to smoke, I think, is in the, if that's your proximal response, I'm worried. But maybe eventually we will be able to get good predictions of urge to smoke, and then we'll be able to go up into the useful category. So useful is whenever your response can be unobtrusively sensed or unobtrusively self-reported. Remember the thumbs down and the thumbs up? That's more unobtrusively self-reported. These are my last 2 slides. This is me following Wendy's orders. So I and all other statisticians, biostatisticians as well, if people like us, we collaborate with people like you who want to build and improve mobile health, just-in-time adaptive interventions. We work on how you design trials, and we develop the data analytics. And of course, our goal is the same as yours. We want the most effective mobile intervention we can. And if you're meeting with us, we're going to ask you these kinds of questions. What proximal response are your interventions really trying to target? You need to have a theory there, a causal model in your mind, like reducing stress might lead to a delayed time till smoking, relapse, and so on. What kind of treatments and how often do you want to provide your treatments? And then how often can you collect your data? All of this is going to be, these are really important questions that we need to understand when we work with people like you. And my contact information. So, thanks so much.